On behalf of the Department of English and Comparative Literature and the American University in Cairo, AUC, I, Ferial Ghazul, welcome Professor Richard Falk and our attendees to the 19th Edward Said Memorial Lecture. Edward Said was a frequent visitor to Egypt and had been invited to lecture as a distinguished university professor several times at AUC. When he passed away, our department, with the support of the AUC administration, arranged for a series of annual Said Memorial Lectures. Most of the lecturers in the series knew Said personally, as did our present lecturer, Professor Richard Falk. The speakers who have delivered the Said Memorial Lectures in the past included distinguished figures from different disciplines: literature, philosophy, music, anthropology, linguistics, politics, and law. And they include, I'll give the names: David Damrosch, Barbara Harlow, Cornel West, Terry Eagleton, Rockis de Groot, Judith Butler, John Carlos Rowe, Michael Wood, Sari Makdisi, Marina Warner, Lila Abulov, Sulaiman Dian, Osama Makdisi, Robert Young, Wadi' Said, Raja Shahadi, Noam Chomsky, and Timothy Brennan. Richard Falk, Professor Emeritus of International Law at Princeton University and Research Professor at the University of California, combines qualities that Edward Said exemplified: academic brilliance and humanitarian activism. His field of study covers international law and human rights. His contribution to legal theory in more than 40 books has marked the field. Professor Richard Falk is prolific. His CV runs to 52 single-spaced pages. He has taught and lectured at dozens of universities in North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa, including AUC. He served as Special Rapporteur of the UN Human Rights Council on occupied Palestinian territories. His works include monographs and edited books on the American Empire, on the Third World, on public imagination, on pursuit of justice, and on climate change. One of his recent books is an autobiographical account entitled Public Intellectual: The Life of a Citizen Pilgrim, in which he highlights his journey and his perspectives. Today, Edward Said Memorial Lecture, Professor Falk intended to address the legacies of Edward Said and his continuing influence in several domains of thought and action, including the 21st century challenges of being a public intellectual, the persisting relevance of his groundbreaking book, Orientalism, and the current phase of the Palestinian struggle for basic rights. Given the urgency of the situation in Gaza, Professor Falk will be focusing today on the Palestinian question. To grasp the far-reaching impact of Professor Falk on academia, I turn now to my colleague, Hani Sayed, from the Department of Law at AUC, a specialist in human rights and humanitarian law and global governance, who will highlight the innovative contributions of Professor Falk in the field of legal theory. Hani.
Thank you, Faryal. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Professor Falk. When Faryal asked me to introduce Professor Richard Falk and to focus on his contributions to international law, I was truly honored and humbled. Honored because I know that the opportunity of introducing one of the most prominent and politically inspiring figures in my academic discipline today, and to reflect on his work, will possibly become in the future one of the high points in my career as an international legal academics. And for that, I'm grateful to Faryal for giving me this opportunity. But I'm also humbled because it's unfathomably hard to convey to a diverse audience his long, rich, and superlative intellectual contributions to international law in the few minutes I have for this introduction. His contribution will certainly be belittled if we reduce to a list of publications for 6 decades or a list of awards and appointments in leading academic institutions, or even as a special rapporteur on the human rights situations in the occupied Palestinian territories, not to mention his very powerful interventions as a public intellectual. At the same time, the fact that my introduction is in the context of the annual Edward Said lecture made the task not only marginally manageable, but also quite exciting as an opportunity to make an intellectual political contribution that befits the enduring legacy of Edward Said and the important contributions of Richard Falk to international law. What I would like to do in introducing Richard Falk by trying to weave his intellectual trajectory with that of Edward Said, each in his own discipline, to form a map that can help us today in understanding the political moment that shaped their respective projects, and perhaps also guide us as we struggle to engage with a cruel and unjust world. In the introduction to his 1983 book, The World, the Text, and the Critic, Edward Said theorized an attitude in literary criticism that he very aptly called secular criticism. In that essay, Said gave a pithy, and as always, beautifully acerbic description of the practice of literary criticism in academia at the time, late 70s, a practice where the ethic of professionalism committed to non-interference in the world has triumphed, a practice where literary critics retreated into a labyrinth of textuality, otherworldly and indifferent, enamored by its precious jargon that with all its formidable complexities obscured social realities. Then, with a confident tone, Edward Said went on to describe the praxis of a secular criticism, and here I quote from Said. He said, criticism can no longer cooperate in or pretend to ignore this enterprise, i.e., the practice of indifference to the world. It is not practicing criticism either to validate the status quo or to join up with priestly caste of acolytes and dogmatic metaphysicians. The realities of power and authority, as well as the resistances offered by men, women, and social movements to institutions, authorities, and orthodoxies, are the realities that make texts possible, that deliver them to their readers, that solicit the attention of critics. I propose, Said continued, that these realities are what should be taken into account by criticism and the critical consciousness. I suppose introducing Professor Falk, the international law academic, as a secular critic is appropriate on many levels. Both Edward Said and Richard Falk, each in its own discipline, have forged their intellectual political project in the same political moment of Cold War, US imperial policies, and an insurrectionist counterculture. The discipline of public international law in the United States of the 1960s and 70s had reached an apogee of professional sophistication. Many international lawyers, including Professor Falk, described the field as a professional milieu in which international lawyers were, and unfortunately still are, stuck in argumentative closed loops because they were divided within themselves and among themselves between two fundamental conceptions of their professional situation. The question that energized their little bubble was how to be relevant and autonomous. Relevant to affect the course of international relations, to be taken seriously by decision makers, and yet to remain autonomous with the distance that would allow them to speak truth to power, to resist capture, and to become a tool for power. This was a deep structure of consciousness for any international lawyer, irrespective of her theoretical affiliation, but it also structured the map of the field understood both as a social milieu and as a shared intellectual enterprise. The spectrum of variations among international lawyers range from, on the one end of the spectrum, the New Haven School's policy science. This was Professor Falk's original affiliation, very aptly described by my friend Hingame Saberi as a school of foundationalist anti-foundationalism. And on the other end, there were various attempts to reconstruct a formalist and positivist jurisprudence that acknowledges politics in a post-formalist, post-metaphysical world, in which there are no agreed overriding principles to resolve the controversy between competing first principles. But overall, the total sum of all the variations coalesced into a field committed in the final analysis to apology to US powers and to the validation of the status quo. In that intellectually routinized and politically conservative milieu, Professor Falk occupied an impossible position. That is impossible from the perspective of his contemporaries who could not imagine a different mode of practice. Falk recognized very quickly that the contradictions of his field are not resolvable internally. There is no mediation between autonomy and relevance that will not eventually collapse into one or the other. Instead, Richard Falk, like Said's secular criticism, decided to turn to the world. Like Edward Said, he was very clear that he will not join a practice of international law either to validate the status quo or to join up with a priestly caste of acolyte and dogmatic metaphysicians. Just like Edward Said, he was convinced that the realities of power and authority, as well as the resistances offered by men, women, and social movements to institutions, authorities, and orthodoxies, are the realities that give substance to legal materials and purpose to legal practice. And this has been a consistent theme in his work from the beginning, starting with his engagement with the cause of third worldism in international law to his position on the Vietnam War. For over 60 years, he was relentless in writing path-breaking work on poverty, ecological decay, human rights violations, conflict, and undemocratic international institutions. Like Edward Said, he was uncompromising in insisting that his critical practice as international lawyer has to be situated, has to be skeptical and secular. Like Edward Said, he also believed that the practice of international law cannot be value-free. Quite the contrary, and here I'm quoting from Said, for the inevitable trajectory of critical consciousness is to arrive at some acute sense of what political, social, and human values are entailed, end of quote, in the labor of law. This is particularly evident in the stream of work between 1968 and 1995, when he was a leading figure in the World Order Models Project, exploring realistically and programmatically how to minimize collective violence, maximize economic well-being, social and political justice, and ecological quality. Like Edward Said, Professor Falk chose to be in the world, and because of that, he was out of place. To be in the world is to reject the comfort and demands of filiation and affiliation. To be worldly is to move closer to concrete context about which, and I quote also from Said, political, moral, and social judgments have to be made, and if not only made, then exposed and demystified. End of quote. This is the stream of work that characterized his later work and his work to appropriate international legal discourse for legitimacy struggles. His string of work on Palestine and the Palestinian struggle has certainly a clear example, and I would mention only a few. His articles in 2005, International Law and the Peace Process, his other article in 2006, International Law and the Palestinian Struggle, and his two books, Palestine, The Legitimacy of Hope, and Palestinian Horizons Towards a Just Peace. The task of introducing a scholar in international law is particularly harder today. International law has a bad reputation. This genocide is being televised. The reduction of the ultimate crime to an exchange of argument bits of legal condemnation and justifications uttered by the gods of international relations or in public statements is hardly the stuff of intellectual and political inspiration. Why? Because as an international lawyer, I'm viscerally aware of the many ways in which international law has been intimately implicated historically and structurally in the consolidation of settler colonialism in Palestine since 1948, in legitimating racial domination and apartheid since 1967, and in obscuring the logic of territorial nationalism, which is as a foundation to the modern state system, at least since the Treaty of Lausanne of 1923, is conceptually impossible without ethnic cleansing through forced population transfers or genocide. But Falk's secular criticism provided for generations of progressive and left international lawyers with a template to engage with the world as international lawyer. Because of his work, I am also, as an international lawyer, equally viscerally aware of how anti-colonial struggles have succeeded in appropriating the formal language of international law and its institutions as a tool to dismantle colonial relations, and as arenas to wage legitimacy struggle, and as a symbolic register to formulate visions for an emancipatory world order. And because of that, I'm very grateful to Professor Falk. My apologies, I spoke for too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Hani, for establishing this correspondence between Edward Said and between him and Richard Falk, you know, two extraordinary minds. Now, Professor Falk, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for these exceptionally challenging introductions. Let me begin by greeting everyone in this Zoom audience and say that it is truly a great honor for me to have this opportunity, and at the same time a formidable challenge to follow in the footsteps of the remarkable group of scholars and thinkers who have preceded me as Said lecturers. The challenge becomes even greater having heard Hani Said's very thoughtful and penetrating assessment of what international law can and should be doing, and how it and the parallelism with Edward Said's work is a very creative innovation in my own understanding. I had never thought in relation to this, although Edward and I had often talked about the relevance of international law to the Palestinian and other political struggles. Let me say also let me precede that by saying that I hope I have the chance at some point to have a real dialogue with Professor Said, because with Professor Syed, as I think I have a lot to learn from what he put before us. And it's very tempting to try to respond briefly now, but I have a rather complete text of my own that is directed more frontally at the situation that is unfolding in nearby Gaza. And I'm grateful to Periel Gazul for her very thoughtful and sensitive introductory remarks. I wish I could be with you in person at AUC and interact more fully, and hope that an occasion situation will arise in the near future that will enable a visit to AUC. When I first thought about what I might focus on in my lecture, I had decided to speak quite generally about Edward's extraordinarily vibrant legacy that makes his life, ideas, and perspectives more relevant 20 years after his death than they ever were. Not many scholars could achieve by their publications Edward's rich and varied intellectual afterlife. In that vein, I thought of reflecting on what it meant to be a public intellectual endowed with Edward's dedication to truth-telling and witnessing, now that we are daily dangerously exposed to what I call a post-truth public discourse that is relied upon by so many world leaders and is insufficiently interrogated by the main media, even in the constitutional democracies that are most vocal in proclaiming their political virtues of welcoming debate and tolerating dissent. In the current crisis, we notice that welcoming pretension quickly evaporates if the stakes are thought to be quite high and the issues in contention are very deep. Earlier, I had intended to offer comments on the experience and messages of Edward's breakthrough book, Orientalism, which brought him fame, but also many misunderstandings that troubled him deeply. Edward's culturally grounded, erudite approach to the relations of the West to the Arab world was always nuanced, pointing to the diversities and cultural failings on both sides that made many of the reductive presentations of such dualisms as the Orient or the Orientalist deeply misleading. Although he believed that Bernard Lewis's view of the Islamic world lent itself to adoption by imperialists in the post-colonial West and was used as a policy tool, there were others in the West whose scholarship about the Orient Said found admirable. It is correct, I think, that the literary works analyzed so well by Said did often unwittingly serve dark designs, and still do, of those that seek to exploit the Islamic world of the Middle East. That is, the imperial forces that are greedy in relation to its energy resources and the subjugation of its peoples to the extent that they obstruct Western imperial projects in the region. It is this framing of the Zionist movement of forced displacement and subjugation of the native resident population of Palestine that stimulated Said's profound critique of the Israeli celebratory and self-righteous narrative, which is currently continuing the gruesome work of forced displacement and dispossession with an ongoing ferocity. Yet in Orientalist centers of power, what appears as genocide is being perceived and ideologized by Western elites and Zionist circles as Israel's right to defend itself against a terrorist opposition. Israel's Hasbara fictionalizes and distorts the realities of what is happening to its advantage. In contrast, the Arab street and the peoples everywhere in the world, including many common folk in the West, are not fooled. They see the images of huge bombs dropped on crowded refugee camps and on hospitals crowded with wounded infants and severely injured adults. They are smart enough to believe what they repeatedly see, which includes stricken parents whose children have died and floors of hospitals covered with the embalmed corpses of young children. In light of such heavy images, can we blame them for becoming enraged by the lame excuses of apologists and genocidal ideologues and by their slogans and posters demanding that something be done to stop the massacre of innocents? I had finally intended to revisit Edward's approach to the Israel-Palestine struggle as remaining one of the few keys that, if properly turned long ago, might have allowed Jews and Arabs to live together peacefully and justly. Historical events, however, have their way of intervening on such plans. The horrifying events of the last 4 weeks in Gaza have led me to reimagine my reflections of the sort I've just mentioned in light of the preoccupying, bloody aftermath of the Hamas attack on October 7th. The catastrophic events daily unfolding in Gaza have also changed my standard academic way of remembering a cherished friend from a safe aesthetic distance. Previously, I had intended to mention a few anecdotes that displayed Edward's joie de vivre. He was great fun to be with, and yet always challenging, especially expecting friends to do better, whether it was on a tennis court or in their engagement with the Palestinian struggle. It was my good fortune that our lives touched one another at several levels. They were additional to the convergence of our shared political commitment to a just and sustainable peace between Israel and Palestine. We both had close ties to Princeton University, and Edward thrilled my graduate seminar by taking over the class each year for one session, which made the following session very difficult for me to handle. His political mentors, Iqbal Ahmed and Ibrahim Abu Lugo, were separately my close friends, and the four of us formed a kind of brain trust on Palestine-Israel that met periodically in Edward's Columbia office. We both often overindulged racket sports, claiming that their value in our lives was partly free psychotherapy. And finally, our children were friends. And last but not least, my first girlfriend was married to Edward's PhD advisor at Harvard, with whom he became a lifelong friend. Of course, there were also fundamental differences which have a relevance to the nature of Edward's particular worldview and ways of being in the world. Edward's birth in Palestine, childhood in Egypt, and adulthood in America gave him that out-of-place sense of exile that his early memoir made famous, an image which puzzled others in his surrounding who regarded him as a role model of super success in America. Yet, as his enticing autobiography makes clear, this sense of not fully belonging anywhere allowed him to feel somewhat at home everywhere, as well as giving him his envisioning of reality both a hybrid national look and imparting a distinctive brand of humanist cosmopolitanism. For myself, although deeply rooted in the American experience from birth, as I grew to maturity, I felt more marginalized, almost to the point of inner exile, mixed with a sense of being a partial expatriate, mainly thanks to my Turkish wife and the time spent together here in Turkey. Undoubtedly, the biggest difference between us was that Edward wrote Orientalism with its worldwide persisting prominence, while, as Hani very generously noted, I wrote several books on international law that few read unless they were forced to do so by idiosyncratic progressive law teachers. Despite the extreme grimness of the topic, I find myself unable to further evade addressing the horrifying Israeli response to the Hamas attack, a response dangerously reinforced by crucial diplomatic cheerleading and funding support offered by the United States, climaxing so far in the provocative movement of 2 aircraft carriers into the Eastern Mediterranean. Leading EU members, along with the UK, also lent and are lending Israel a helping hand. In view of this ongoing saga in Gaza, this is such a deeply disturbing and dangerous set of developments as to dominate present political consciousness of almost everyone. It is literally impossible for me, even especially in a Middle Eastern venue, to focus on anything else than this unfolding genocidal crisis, transparently and vividly portrayed day and night on TV. I believe this abrupt change of emphasis is faithful to the personality, character, and commitment of Edward Said. He possessed amazing gifts of merging analytical mastery with a passionate ethical immersion in the historical present. Confronting the grim happenings in Gaza would have certainly aroused in Edward an intense response of outrage, not directed alone at the genocidal policies animating Israel's leaders and being cruelly carried out against a totally vulnerable and captive civilian population of Gaza. This ordeal was epitomized by the death, maiming, and traumatizing of every single child in Gaza. and the documented bombings, as I've already alluded to, of hospitals, medical convoys, refugee camps, schools, UN buildings, and aggravated by the official blood-curdling Israeli decree cutting off all deliveries of food, electricity, and fuel to the already impoverished Gazan population, that has the highest, that had before this crisis the highest unemployment and poverty rates in the world, as a result of 16 years of an economy crippling blockade. This were not enough. The Israeli attack was waged in a manner that accentuated these terrifying underlying conditions, highlighted by the impossible forced ordering of 1 million Palestinians in the northern half of Gaza to abandon their homes and go south with literally no way, no safe way to get there, and no safe place if they manage to do so. Literally a mandatory directive that could neither be followed or ignored, a nightmare beyond even Kafka's dark imagining. I'm quite sure that if Edward were addressing this audience, he would also vent his rage at the complicity of the US government and the refusal of the corporate media to fulfill its commitment to approach world news as if truth and reality were what they were concerned about. Instead, what we have witnessed is that the media in the West functioned largely as agents for the dissemination of a pro-Israeli narrative. These views were backed by belligerent government spokespersons and think tanks in Washington that continue even now to insist that genocide is self-defense. Instead of giving some airtime to critics of Israel's behavior, even realist mainstreamers like John Mearsheimer, Stephen Walton, Anatol Levin, the most respected news channels, including CNN, repeatedly invite as their guests IDF spokesmen or leaders, and an endless stream of generals, intelligence professionals, and think tank experts in the Washington environment who dwell on the obstacles facing Israel's unquestioned alleged mission of destroying Hamas as an organization and killing as many of its leaders as it can find. The commentary that we hear does not only rarely, very rarely, complicates this portrayal of Hamas as characterized by terrorists, although it often cautions meaninglessly Israel to conduct its operations within the limits set by international law and do its best to spare civilian casualties. This is absurd guidance given what we've seen happen in these past 3 weeks. If we are to gain a measure of objectivity about what's going on, it's necessary to deconstruct some of the propaganda that has muddied the waters of understanding throughout the global West. while not fooling the street protests throughout most of the rest of the world. First of all, the reductive presentation of Hamas as only a terrorist organization, when in fact it is the elected government of an occupied territory that is supposed to be subject to the Fourth Geneva Convention, which outlines the obligations of Israel as the occupying power and gives a special emphasis to the legal and moral duty to protect the civilian population. Second point, the manipulative identification of Hamas as synonymous with the October 7th attack, which, if it is as it seems to be, is certainly an undertaking, however provoked, that is fraught with extreme criminality and patent cruelty. The attack, even if as barbaric as it's being portrayed, and which on the basis of past reportage from Israel there is reason to be suspicious about, overlooks the fact that Hamas has been administering Gaza since 2007 as a political actor, despite the enclave being controlled by Israel and seen by the world as the largest open-air prison, which has subjected its inmates to a punitive blockade that was designed to keep all Gazans, according to Israeli official commentary, on a subsistence diet. Whatever else Hamas is, it is a political actor that has been representing the people of Gaza, is entitled to exercise rights of resistance under limits set by international law. Hamas has earned legitimacy and respect as a continuing source of active resistance, something that at least since Arafat's death has completely eluded the Palestinian Authority with its well-known collaborative security relations with Israel. The commission of a war crime, however heinous, does not reduce a political actor to an embodiment of terrorism. If this logic prevailed, Israel would have been a terrorist movement from the early days of the Nakba in 1948 and many times before and since. Extreme crimes of a non-state and state character were perpetrated by the Zionist movement before 1948 and by Israel since that time. These documented crimes include collective punishment and apartheid as contemporary examples of pre-October 7th criminality. Recently, the UN Secretary General tried his best to overcome the good versus evil dualism of Israeli Hasbara by telling the assembled governments at the UN that the Hamas attack, which he also strongly condemned, did not occur in a vacuum. For daring to speak this simple truth, Guterres was pilloried for suggesting, however mildly and indirectly, that Israel provoked the people of Gaza for so long and so severely that acts of resistance were an almost inevitable response, and as such called for self-scrutiny on Israel's part, as well as a self-blinding orgy of vengeance. Once more, Israel's exaggerated response, demanding the resignation of Guterres, achieved its intended result of repudiating truth-telling and debate and shifting attention from the message to the messenger. A third point, even those seeking a post-Hamas role for the PLO and PA in Gaza, and as the sole continuing representative of Palestine, seem to believe that such a solution is moderate in the sense that it implies zero tolerance to the assertion of any form of armed resistance and a low profile advocacy of legal rights, such as the objections to settlement expansion and land grabbing in the West Bank and settler crimes against the occupied native population enjoying impunity from Israeli security forces. Security restrictions on political activity disappear when settlers embark on a violent rampage that kills and wounds even those Palestinian residents of the West Bank who accept their fate as a permanently occupied people. It is instructive to compare Israel's middle-of-the-night terrorizing arrests carried out against stone-throwing children with their forbearance toward the lethal violence of the settlers. The fourth point that's relevant, this settler phenomenon is itself a defiant and massive violation of Article 49, paragraph 6 of the Geneva Convention 4, and it is something that Zionist militants have long sought to convert into sovereign control over the West Bank. In this sense, as with a skilled magician, Israeli leaders are content to have public attention preoccupied with Gaza rather than focused on the real endgame of Zionist maximalism, which centers on achieving sovereign control over the West Bank, the only part of the promised land that is supposed to be biblically a biblical entitlement of Israel, yet to be reabsorbed into the Jewish supremacist apartheid state. As with Gaza, the Israeli settlers are not shy about revealing their goals by way of menacing threats directed at the Palestinians. It was almost unnoticed in Western media that after a violent demonstration a few days ago in the West Bank, Palestinian cars in the neighborhood were leafleted with a simple, chilling message: leave or we will kill you. The fifth and last point in this effort to give perspective to the situation suggests that it needs to be stressed that the present unity government in Israel is a temporary war response to October 7th that overcame earlier divisions among Israeli Jews because of the broad ethnic consensus that now prevails that vengeance without restraint was justified in response and indeed necessary if Israel had any hope of avoiding future attacks. More tangibly, this meant finding an alternative to Hamas to administer Gaza in the future that curbed Palestinian militancy, whether from Hamas or other Palestinian groups, of which currently Islamic Jihad is best known, but far from the only one. Liberal Zionists argue that such a policing approach has almost no chance of succeeding unless it gives Palestinian people some sense that Israel is prepared to finally walk the walk of a two-state solution comprising at the very least the West Bank and East Jerusalem as its capital. I find this to be a totally dubious day after tomorrow's scenario, but most of all because the Netanyahu-led government emphatically doesn't want it and never has. It has almost been erased from our collective memory that the Netanyahu coalition that took control at the beginning of 2023 was generally described as the most extremist government in the entire history of Israel. If it had its way, and now may get its way, it would establish greater Israel under the smokescreen of Gaza and geopolitical worries about a wider war damaging the world economy and destructive of fragile regional stability. I firmly believe that this total rejection of Palestinian territorial grievances and rights under international law is at the core of the real Israeli peace plan. Even in the highly unlikely event that Netanyahu is forced to resign, given his responsibility for the intelligence and security failure that allowed October 7th to happen, this kind of future for Israel-Palestine seems a non-starter. Over 500,000 in the West Bank will fight Tel Aviv as the settler community, rather than having their expansionist ambitions thwarted by implementing any kind of agreement that requires a durable accommodation with the Palestinians. At minimum, this presupposes a freezing of the settlement construction, or more radically, some withdrawal beyond the pre-1967 border. The outcomes in Gaza and West Bank, although weakening Israel's standing regionally and globally, may have the perverse effect of stiffening their willingness to risk everything by mounting a campaign to erase the Palestinian challenge, and not just in Gaza once and for all, even if this means a consummated genocide. I want to just say a few words about the wider implications of what is happening in Israel and Gaza, the West Bank. It comes in connection with a preceded it and was highlighted by the Ukraine war that appeared to signal an end to the US-dominated post-Cold War world. The Gaza war has its importance partly because it complements that explanation of why the Ukraine war was so geopolitically important, because it was an occasion that challenged the geopolitical alignment of unipolarity and created a moment where Russia and China could advance the case and the reality of multipolarity in the company of the BRICS and other tendencies in international life. In other words, you found in the context of the Israel-Palestine struggle a second major conflict zone of crucial importance to the West, and creating a resemblance to Huntington's thesis of a clash of civilization that was so fashionable after the Cold War. It now has a new kind of fashionable relevance and was given a religious spin and a counter-terrorist understanding by Emmanuel Macron during his visit to Israel in prior days. And what that sees is a new clash of civilization involving Iran, the Houthis, Hezbollah. In other words, the larger context of the Hamas action as a threat to the Western design for controlling the Middle East and its energy resources. So this whole series of events, horrible as it is also extremely important in relation to a transformative moment in world order that occurred arguably at the end of World War II, and again when the Soviet Union imploded, and possibly again in 2001 with the Al-Qaeda attack on the World Trade Center and Pentagon. We now, in 2023, are facing a new such moment. And I think this will affect how we reconceive after the smoke clears the situation in Israel and Palestine. I want to end by referring to what I think are the three most relevant futures there. What I would call the pessimist future is that Israel has the capability, despite alienating people all over the world, to win the peace by establishing a greater Israel that includes the West Bank and is able to reconstitute the governance of Gaza under a compliant Palestinian Authority leadership. I would think that this outcome would not begin to satisfy internal or international demands for a genuine solution, and would not end or even mitigate the apartheid nature of present Israeli governance, or end the striving to generate meaningful assistance. This is countered by a utopian alternative, which holds that Israel will be found responsible for the criminality of its Gaza campaign, requiring accountability of the main perpetrators of the crime and reparations done to Palestinians for the damage they endured to their homes and property. And most of all, and a point that Edward Said always stressed, an acknowledgement by the Israeli president and prime minister of the historic wrongs done to the Palestinian people, especially the Nakba and subsequent abuses. Edward used these words, which I think he meant very deeply. There will never be peace until there is such an acknowledgement being made. Democratic secularism in a unified or coexisting state for Jews and for Palestinians, based not on ethnic or religious criteria, but on democratic elections and human rights. A grant of the right of return to all Palestinian refugees and their descendants. Zionism must revert to the Balfour Pledge of a Jewish homeland, but not expect to administer and govern a Jewish state. In other words, a solution conformed to the realities of Israel that resembles what happened in South Africa after its leaders surprisingly decided to dismantle apartheid, release Nelson Mandela from prison after 27 years, and hold free elections for a multi-ethnic constitution. This second scenario, however desirable, I think is genuinely utopian, and there is no plausible horizon of realization that can presently be anticipated. But what happens in the event of a future mobilization of global solidarity of a more militant form and revived resistance is not beyond the realm of possibility that something along positive lines will happen. The third and most likely scenario is a muddling through of the sort that has existed ever since the 1967 war. Apartheid remains, resistance remains, solidarity begins to shift the balance of forces, but whether it does so enough to change the realities is hard to predict. There will be no White House handshake if whatever the future holds. In concluding, let me say that I believe that Edward would have agreed with most of this, although his many virtues were ones of intellectual independence and on occasion a certain cantankerousness. He could approach me after these remarks with a grim scowl and a characteristic put down. Richard, you can't be serious. My remarks were quite academic, but the events evoked the strongest of emotion, and I confess my partisanship. This is a time, I believe, for persons of conscience to take action as well as to pierce and discredit the propaganda. It is a time to confront the double standards and hypocrisies of the global West. It is also a time to mourn and grieve the losses endured by the Palestinians, but also a time to show solidarity with their struggle for peace and justice that will continue. And finally, this is a time to repudiate the horrors of warfare and political violence and base our lives on the power of love, courage, and hope. I thank you all for your patience and welcoming your questions and responses. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Professor Falk, for your revealing and timely lecture and for your willingness to respond to questions that have been on the mind of the AUC community, faculty, and students. The questions relate to the present day situation in Gaza, Palestine, to the day before, and to the day after. Okay? You ended your talk by saying how we need to take action and dismantle propaganda. One way would be is to go through a legal battle. So I'm just wondering, how does the International Court of Justice function in the present day, and how feasible for it to condemn war crimes that are unfolding in front of our very eyes? In particular, who can initiate action in the court? Could the demonstrators in Washington, D.C., in London, and all over the world initiate such an action?
Well, if you're talking about criminal action for the crimes, I think you probably intend reference to the International Criminal Court rather than to the International Court of Justice, which limits itself to disputes between governments and to requests for advisory opinions from organs of the UN. Is that correct?
Yes.
That you're, and the International Criminal Court does give the prosecutor broad authority to entertain complaints about war crimes. Neither Israel nor the US are parties to the Rome Statute that governs the behavior of the court. On the other hand, it was determined recently, a couple of years ago, that the court does have jurisdiction over Palestinian complaints about Israeli crimes committed after 2014, because it's a party to the Rome Statute, and these crimes were committed on its territory. the crimes in Gaza would be considered occupied Palestinian territory, and therefore there is a broad set of possibilities of appealing to the court. Having said that, one has to understand that the court, like most international institutions, especially judicial ones, is a very slow-moving mechanism. And in a case that has such a controversial political edge to it, it will be slower than ever, I would predict. And the prosecutor, the present prosecutor, who is I believe, a British national, has shown a reluctance to proceed against Israel for the 2014 investigation, even though he's authorized to do so. And so I think the submission to the court is an important symbolic act. It will not, in all likelihood, produce prison sentences for Netanyahu and his colleagues. But what it will do is give legitimacy to those people in the street, and it will empower civil society, whether it's through a people's tribunal that could be constituted, could act rapidly, and seems entirely appropriate to influence public opinion. And I would recommend strongly that in addition to the formal international institutions, thought be given to a civil society initiative of creating what Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher, did during the Vietnam War, which was to create the Russell Tribunal, that at the time was dismissed by the media and sources of authority, but has exerted a long time positive influence on many other initiatives taken along the same line throughout the world. It's not perfect, and it's not likely by itself to produce change, but it is something that can be done, and it can be done in real time of a politically appropriate nature, and I would urge it.
Thank you. We have another question that relates to the past. It's from the history department, Dr. Pascal Razali. She's amazed, okay? How have 75 years of brutal Israeli occupation, land theft, and eradication of Palestinian history been all but erased from public discourse in a matter of weeks? How could one counter Israel's totalizing references to October 7 with the weight of this history? And how is it possible for Israel's leadership to advocate genocide of the Palestinians, given the terrible legacy of the Holocaust?
Well, those are very intriguing and deep questions. How this happens is a reflection of the way in which authority and power are constituted in the world. And Israel has had the good fortune, the Palestinians have endured the bad fortune of having the most powerful geopolitical actor defend their every move, including these genocidal this genocidal onslaught of the past 4 weeks. And this is the way the world is designed to work. This issue of geopolitical primacy is buried under a lot of rhetoric that purports to take international law as a law that binds every state, whether they're powerful or weak. But if you look at the UN Charter, the 5 winners in World War II were given a veto, which is a way of saying those 5 most powerful, most dangerous countries have to have the right to disobey the UN Charter and international law whenever their strategic interests so dictate. And this idea that power of the powerful is what shapes the justice and injustice that goes on in the world is very deeply ingrained. The trials of German and Japanese war criminals after World War II was a clear case of victor's justice because the crimes of the victors were completely excluded from accountability. And probably the worst crime in the war was the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And yet that was immunized, given impunity. And so you have a system where the powerful vindicate the old slogan, might makes right. And that is the story, the tragic story of the Palestinians being displaced from their native country, made to feel strangers in their homeland, and and it has an Orwellian twist that we now hear that genocide is part of a right of a state to defend itself. The constant reaffirmation of Israel's claims with respect to Gaza, that it's only doing what it is entitled to do because every state can defend itself. That is a complete annihilation of what we see on our television screens and what the experience that the peoples of the world see and are demonstrating against. And one should not believe in what's becoming a multipolar world, that the global West is the only source of insight and understanding. There are lots of people that have solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, including lots of people in the global West. Even though the governments are taking unprecedented steps to discourage protest and shows of sympathy for the Palestinian cause, the people are reacting against that, or many people, not all people. And Zionism is strong in the settler colonial states like my own, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. All those settler colonial states have strong Zionist organizations that exert a great deal of influence. So that's part of this reality of how the world works. But one should not give up hope. South Africa changed in ways that no one could have anticipated until it happened. And when it happened, it seemed natural, but it was an outcome of people acting as if they had power. See, what is needed is for that psychological shift to take place, that people are not powerless. They have the ultimate power, but they have to have the courage and the insight to use it and use it intelligently and effectively.
We have another question more about the future from Dr. Bahjat Qurani, Department of Political Science. This is his question. After all such destruction and atrocities in Gaza, what does the day after look like? And how you, Richard Falk, would like it to look like?
Well, it gives every indication of looking like a devastated and war annihilated society with the people traumatized by this daily heavy military onslaught that they have experienced in this crowded, tiny enclave. It is, if one imagines oneself as being there, one can begin to understand, I think, the extraordinary psychological burden that is imposed, even if one is miraculously spared physical harm to oneself or one's loved ones. Even if one has that kind of miracle, which I doubt is very shared, very common, it still is impossible to imagine emerging from that experience without a sense of terror and being terrified. This is one way of thinking about this Israeli retaliatory campaign, is as the most intense form of state terror that the world has experienced. Intense in both its severity and its duration. We think of usually terrorism as a single act, but this has been a process that has gone on for almost 4 weeks, and according to Netanyahu, will go on for possibly months. It's unimaginable, unimaginably horrible. So that's my prediction of the situation. What would I like to see happen? Of course, I'd like to see a miracle happen. I'd like to see somehow the Gaza rebuilt, the people given real sovereignty over their lives, given a chance to develop the resources of their country, given the dignity that they've been deprived of for these 75 years. The world owes a great debt to the Gazan population, and it can repay that debt. It's a debt of inscribed in law, in morality, in the spirituality of being human. And that debt, if it's to be discharged, would take an enormous effort and a radically altered viewpoint in the elite centers of power in the global West, especially the US and the leading EU countries. I wish I could say I was hopeful about that happening, but I'm not so much of a prophet of the future that I can exclude miraculous, unanticipated development.
We have a question from the students on modes of intellectual resistance from the AUC students. What can emerging scholars and academics do in these critical times in support of humane causes, as in today's Gaza? And how can civil society, nationally and globally, promote equity and justice, given the failure of international organizations to do so?
Well, that's I call a core question, because it relates to what I've been saying in my responses to the earlier question. People must awaken to their own power. And what they concretely do is a function of their place and personality and their priorities. There's no one size fits all when it comes to meaningful political action. If you were in South Africa, in apartheid South Africa, you would do one set of things. And if you're a African American in relation to racism in America, you do a quite different set of things based on your understanding of what is possible, what is desirable, where the levers of power really are, how to collaborate with those who are being victimized. It requires not only an emotional commitment, it requires an intellectual effort to understand what the levers of potential power really are and what the strategic point can be. I've mentioned the idea of people's tribunals as one way of using international law symbolically to awaken people to the realities of what are happening in a way that formal institutions are unable to do, because they're subject to the strictures of state power and geopolitical influence over that state power. You saw how the UN Secretary General was chastised and told to resign because he mildly urged upon the government that account be taken of the fact that October 7th was not only a unforgivable occasion of terrorist crime, but it was provoked by months and years of abuse of the Palestinian people, and especially in Gaza. And it was something that was almost an inevitable expression of frustration and desperation, given a kind of timeliness by Netanyahu's going before the UN General Assembly, waving a map which showed that Palestine no longer existed. And one way of interpreting this show of dramatic existence is it's an exclamation point. We Palestinians are here. We have not abandoned our homeland. And in a sense, that is what resistance is all about. And there are two things at stake. One is resisting evil, and the other is pursuing the good. And I think there's an opportunity for students and all of us to do both things. They're both crucially important.
We have a question from the Department of Comparative Literature, English and Comparative Literature, from Dr. Tahia Abdel Nasser on the personal and political struggles. So the question is, how do you see the relationship between your recent memoir, Public Intellectual, The Life of a Citizen Pilgrim, and your academic and activist work on Palestine? And in what sense do memoirs, such as your memoir and Edward Said's Out of Place, a memoir, contribute to a global struggle?
Well, I can only speak for myself, of course. I saw the memoir as a way of interpreting this connection between the way I've chosen to live my life, involving both its personal dimension and its engagement with the world, very much in line with what was said in the introductory statement of Professor Said. And especially about the early book of Edward's, the text and the world. I forget the exact title, but it was about the relationship between the written word and the work acting normatively in the world. And that seems to me to be something important to a lot of people. I mean, in terms of the feedback I've gotten from the publication of my own memoir, is that people appreciate this attempt, however frustrated it has been by the flow of history, to do the right thing and to put your body on the line, so to speak, on behalf of doing the right thing. And in Edward's big way and my small way, we have both tried to do
that. We have one more question, if you will accept a last question. It's from your friend, Dr. Ibrahim Awad from the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies. This is his comment and question. Edward Said was critical of the Oslo Accords. And as a former special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian occupied territories, you are well aware of the living conditions in Gaza, which has been besieged for the last 16 years. If you had a conversation with Said now, would he make the Oslo Accords responsible in a way or another for the current war in Gaza? If he would, how would he develop this argument?
Well, you know, Edward was such a creative and individual thinker that it's almost an act of hubris to put words in his words in my mouth. But I remember very vividly having one of my few arguments with Edward about the Oslo. At the time when the Oslo Accords were agreed upon, I took the view that he should give them a chance and that it would be part of the dialogue, that it was important to enter the dialogue as it was being framed through the Oslo Accords. And although his substantive reasons for rejecting them turned out to be correct and prophetic in a way, I thought that at the time there seemed to be at least a small possibility that this would result in a Palestinian state. Now, I underestimated at that time the cynicism and the way in which the Zionist project has operated throughout its history, which is one of taking what you can get when you can get it. And for Israel, the Oslo Accords were an opportunity to destroy the viability of a Palestinian state rather than to move toward its creation. And the way of destroying it was to encourage the settlement expansion and to create a system of Israeli presence on the West Bank, which was the principal territory that would serve as a state for the Palestinians, and in that sense, what I know now, even before October 7th, would have led me to say, don't be a fool. Israel is not interested in a process that results in a fair solution for the Palestinians. They're just not interested in it. And that includes a spectrum of Israeli opinion that goes from what they call the moderate left to the far right. There are people, individuals like Jeff Halper is one in Israel that are genuinely dedicated to a just peace and a fair coexistence between Arabs and Jews. But they're a marginalized, politically irrelevant minority. I mean, journalists like Gideon Levy and Amira Haas are important voices of moral clarity, but they have no political traction, as far as I can tell, in the current atmosphere that prevails in Israel. And they have never been able to do more than serve as a show that Israel accommodates its critics and dissenters. And it's true, as I've pointed out sometimes, that a Gideon Levy couldn't get published regularly in the New York Times, for instance, or that in some ways there's more freedom of speech about the crimes and wrongdoings of Israel in Israel than in the United States. In the United States, people like me are forced to the margin and making our views known through online publications that are basically read by people that are not in the political mainstream. So it's a very peculiar world where we're living in, where it's very difficult, if not impossible, to get a what shall I say, a solid foundation for a just perspective on the future.
Thank you, Professor Falk, for your generous time and for an inspiring webinar. As we say in Arabic, may your likes multiply. You don't only speak truth to power, but your example resurrects our hope for humanity and a better world.
Thank you so much. It's
Well,
been a very challenging, stimulating session for me. And I thank Connie as well and hope we have that dialogue one of these days.
in person.
In person.
I really hope so.
But
Thank
take
you.
care. I wish you all very good fortune. Hope that this horrible activity near your borders ends as soon as possible, and that something unexpectedly good happens.
Miracle.
Miracle. You know, the English poet W.H. Auden wrote this line: "We who are about to die demand miracles." This is a moment where we demand miracles. He also has a line in his famous poem on the start of World War II saying, "We must love one another or die."
Well, we
Take
will
care.
keep hope going. We'll keep hopeful
Yeah. And
not give up.
part
And
of hope
Edward
is-
Said always said, go on,
yes,
you know, press on, don't give up.
yes. The Irish playwright Samuel Beckett kept saying, "Fail better."
That's right. Fail, try again,
Yes.
fail again, fail better.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank
Thank
you all.